It's really meaningful for me to be here for many reasons. First of all, to be in the community that's formed by Lyndon and Rosanna, both local and international. And the other is, although I lived most of my life in North America and Europe and different places, I'm Chinese by blood, so it really means a lot for me to be here and share some of my thoughts and my work with this audience here. Uh, the theme of this design festival is a theme that is very important to me. You know, as an educator, as an architect, as a thinker. I think for many of you or many of us who are architects, who are designers, who are in the creative business, uh, the beginning is always important. You know, the architect Louis Kahn always talked about the importance of beginning. And I think for me, no matter how far you are in the design field, whether you have been an architect or designer for 3 years, for 30 years, I think you always look for and savor those moments that reminds you of why you want to be an architect or why you want to be a designer in the first place. As one grows older, you know, these moments are further and further apart and fewer apart. But I would say um, today has been one of these moments, you know, just to see the presentation of Anders, of Shai, of Bunsum. You know, it's one of these moments that reminds you why you want to be an architect or a designer. And it's inspirational. And thank you for that. I've been invited to make a 45-minute presentation, and I realize it's about 2,700 seconds. So I have about 270 slides, so about 10 seconds. I'll try to go faster. Yeah. I think the whole theme about um, is for me is to reflect. We always move forward. We always move forward at different paces. Sometimes we go very fast. Sometimes we go very slow. Sometimes they are pace of one's own doing, and sometimes it's the circumstances and environment that propels us in these spaces. But I think to have the luxury to reflect upon one's own production, one's thinking, one's journey is always important because it helps you reposition your speed as you move along. I think when we think back into our journey as architects, the last 25 years, being situated in Los Angeles, the real fabric of the city, you know, has been the residential sector. So whether they be housing or houses, you know, that scale of architecture really forms the city. And it's always something that scale that continues to inform us. And now, as we are working on more institutional scale projects, um, looking back at these early projects are always important. Understanding the scale, how it directly relates to human scale. Um, this is not moving. Oh, now it is. Sorry, I'm going to get used to this pace. So today, as we work with like larger housing scale projects with developers, I think thinking back in that original scale of the client and that relationship, that one-to-one relationship, is important. We have worked with the arts since the very beginning. We have always been close to artists, to designers and curators. And it's interesting how, although it was not directly planned, how many of their way of practices have informed us. So this is a moment, I think, in our career when we think back and ask ourselves, what are the things that inspire the most that we'd like to continue to do in the next, hopefully, 25 years? And I think one of them is collaborative practices. You know, I think Bunsum talked about how much does an architect invest oneself in the project? Is it 50%? What does nature play the other 50%? And how do others play the percentages in the creation of the project? And I think more and more so, I look for these moments where we can bring more creative minds together on a project. I think this is what we believe, that how cities have been built in the past and how cities could continue to be built in the future. Okay, now I'm getting the pace of it. Yeah. So these single family houses for us are a very small part of the city fabric. You know, it's just something that for us always belonged to the ecology of the city. Raina Banham, the British writer and theorist, about 50 years ago, wrote this book about Los Angeles, the architecture of four ecologies. And he talked about four different landscapes. One is the beach, one is the plains, one are the hills, and one is the landscape that relates to cars. Autopia was what he called. So in more ways than one, I think all our projects try to respond to these landscapes, even though the city has grown and matured over the last 50 years. But the natural ecology of these places, the foothills, the hillsides, and the beachside always maintains that same essence. Um, about 10 years ago, we designed this pavilion in Shanghai for the West Bund Biennial that was designed actually for exhibition. And we didn't know what the building would turn into. I think for the last 10 years, it was the Center for Photography. But many of the ideas of the car actually informed the design of this project, although it's not built in Los Angeles, but the notion of having three things that are directed towards the exterior versus three elements that are directed towards the interior has to do with this dichotomy between introspection and extroversion. So the original idea of this is the three pavilions that look out are the three garages that are connected to the street, and then it's a much more introspective space that focuses on the interior. So as we are working on museum scale projects or art scale projects, I think this house scale is always very present. This is a project that we just finished in Japan, in Kyoto, right in front of a canal. I think you can see, some of the historical elements, the Mariucci windows, something that came up from wood construction, but became translated to concrete, or the whole notion of this canopy that directs the window to look down into the canal, into the cherry blossom, was something that came from traditional and historical architecture, but for us fits into a more modern complex, or context, I should say. I think there's also a sense of classicism, that's always in our work, whether it's sometimes more latent, sometimes there's more obvious. I think for us, modern architecture is not necessarily a break from that notion of classicism. There are thinkers like Colin Rowe that begins to make that connection. Sometimes it's contrived, or sometimes it's pitched against what Rainer Benham sees as a more futuristic or more projective way of understanding. And I think the context that we work in is not always a modern context. Even in the US or even in Los Angeles or America, I think oftentimes we have very different contexts that even when the demand is something quite modern, there's sometimes asked for a certain latent classicism or order that is inherent into our projects. I think this also begins to transpire in some of the art and institutional or commercial scale projects we have, whether it be a colonnade, whether it be a grid, that begins to respond to a more urban and larger urban scale versus a more domestic retail scale. This is a project in Miami. And as I think about the projects that we are working on right now, oftentimes in suburban America, whether it be medical compacts, or a housing projects in Miami, this is a new scale that we're working on in different areas that we're not as familiar with. But we're thinking about these different scales of the scale of the city versus the scale of the immediate street. This is a project in Kansas City, or Phoenix, Arizona. So this is, I think, reminding myself and reflecting on the earlier small scale projects, how it engages in a very direct scale, has been very informative for us as we're dealing with this new scale that we're working on, that we're less familiar with. So when I think back on a lot of these projects that we have, I think one of the things that the very first project that we ever worked on was in Marfa, Texas. And this notion of responding to the presence of other creative beings was already very present. This is the small town that the artist Donald Judd in the 60s moved there and created a world that's an art world of installations and areas for performances and work that are integrated within a very small domestic town in West Texas. So when we started working on these projects, sometimes renovating some of these small West Texas houses, adding new buildings, artist studios, studios for writers and poets in residency. That relationship between artists and writers already was created in our very first projects. Many of this work continues to do. These are the single family houses that begin to emerge. Many of these communities that we have built have relationships that was developed then, whether it be artists or young curators. Eventually, we became our fellow travelers, in our careers. Oftentimes we started on working on their installations. We collaborate on the gallery projects. We work on their museum projects. And then we begin to work on houses for the artists, collectors. We work with curators on their museum projects. Some of these curators become museum directors, and now we're working with them on their museum projects. So many of them were fellow travelers that we have started off at the beginning of our career. Linda mentioned Frank Gehry. I remember when Frank Gehry, about the time he won the Pritzker Prize, he was interviewed, and interviewer asked him, how do you feel? You start your project, you start your career working with artists, with a lot of bohemians, with a lot of challenged budgets and circumstances, and now you're working on these high budget projects. How do you feel about that? And Frank, in a way, answered that, my clients were all the same. They just became very successful. So I think for me, it's an interesting way of thinking about how you always have the same people that you work with, but then you grow together in the world. You grow together in the work. So I think these art projects, the gallery projects, working with the artists, eventually inform a lot of our practice, as well as sometimes we were invited to curate projects. So this is one of the first curatorial projects that we've done for a gallery, where we invited artists that dealt with architectural theme projects, whether it be photographers like Sugimoto, James Welling, to conceptual artists like Walid Beshti. In this case, he tried to recreate that famous picture of Charlotte Perriand sitting on the chair that she collaborated with Corbusier, creating this intense light that she has to turn her head and create and casted a shadow on the wall, for example. Or Walid Beshti, once again, looking for all the props that Corbusier used in his photographs in Ville-Savoye, together with some of these vintage furniture of Corbusier's. These curatorial practice continues. Exhibition designs. This is a project in Berlin. Even when we're working on museum scale projects or larger scale projects, I think this scale of projects are very important for us, because the creativity is very important, and this dialogue is always constant. So we go out of our way to seek for these type of projects, because this is something that really gives us the creative engine for our work. I think one of these moments when everything came together was the 2017 Chicago Architectural Biennial, when we got to work with 120 architects, from designers from all around the world, to design these spaces and installations in the Chicago Cultural Center. So on one hand, we wanted to address the history of the city, like this Adolf Loos Chicago Tribune Tower, as well as Ludwig Hilberseimer, that also presented these two schemes in the 1920s to anchor this installation. We invited 16 other architects to design a series of towers, in about 3-meter tall towers that are both scale models of towers, as well as one-to-one scale columns that one could experience and look up to, as opposed to looking through a screen or looking down into a diorama. So a group of architects, from Moss, from USA to Portugal to London, all came about. Francis Kéré, interpreted the scheme very differently to see what was asked for in the 1920s could be reinterpreted, could be critiqued in 2017. Tatiana Bilbao. Another room is we asked architects to select an interior photograph that was important in their work and reinterpret them as either a model or as a diorama. So there are about 24, 25 of these installations that are built on foundations or bases that actually form the floor plan of Mies van der Rohe's IIT campus, original IIT campus plan. So all of these are very much more immersive in terms of how one experiences. It's very different from experiencing the towers where you look up, where you're oftenly distracted. A lot of these presentations, you really have to look into like a pinhole and be completely indulged in that world. So two different ways of experiencing architecture or experiencing design. And also in a way to create these dialogues with the great rooms that were in the Chicago Cultural Center, which used to be a lobby. So oftentimes new construction were made that are architectural scale, that you can actually go in. They're actually small pavilions or rooms that you could walk into. I think for us, working on a biennial is really creating different possibilities of dialogues. It's not really creating themes. There are rules that begin to dictate it, but as a dialogue to create a shared platform where different unexpected relationships could be experienced. In many ways, I think today's whole event, this curation, I really appreciate not only the different geographies that Lyndon and Rosanna has brought together, but also different ways of looking at the world. I think you can unpack all the presenters today and really reconstruct where we are today as a creative community. Frida Escobedo, this is a Colombian architect, Camilo Restrepo, really looking at these neglected spaces of hallways and corridors and how they could be a source of design, and so when I think back in our very early projects, I think this was a project that was not realized for Ordos, where 100 architects were invited to design a villa, amongst many. Simon from HHF was part of this. Although this project was never realized, we oftentimes think about what were the outcome of this project. This is like a big architecture zoo with 100 animals. Everyone had their own agenda, and the context was completely contrived. And when we work on this, we were really thinking of not the first house, not the primitive hut, but the second house. After the primitive house was done, what is the next move? It's really the double house. So when the house needs to expand, the primitive hut needs to expand, becomes a double house. It's almost like taking the first step before a house becomes a city. So although this project was not built, I think this model stayed with us and was very important for us in other projects when we think about repetition and also seriality. But more importantly, I think it created a community that other projects begin to emerge from this initial encounter in Ordos Mongolia. This is one of these projects also not realized, where 10 architects were brought together, everyone designing a different building housing project in Switzerland. So Alejandro Aravena, Lakatam Fasal was one of that. Or another project that we worked with HHF in Rome, in Grottaferrata, where we design projects together that includes an art center, a housing project, as well as an educational center. So these are projects. These are the type of relationships of working with people that I'm inspired by, that I like, that I respect, things that I look forward to continue. So as I think about these art projects that we have been working on, sometimes art projects that are scattered, that are serial, that are not one singular building, but many different buildings that either engage the city or engage a landscape like a park. Many of these projects fits into that. Now, this is an exhibition project that really, in a way, describes this idea of collaboration. This is for the Lisbon Architecture Triennale a few years ago, where the curators invited 3 architectural offices, ours, Johnson Markley, with Nuno Brandão Costas from Portugal, and office, Kirsten Gears and David Van Severen from Brussels, to collaborate to design a pavilion together. So we got together and we didn't know how to proceed. So what we decide is that we each choose 2 rooms from each other's projects. We don't choose our own, but we pick 2 rooms, or we pick a project and pick 2 rooms of their projects. And then the aggregation of these rooms become the building itself. So this is a project of 12 rooms. These are our projects that was chosen by the other two architects. And then in a way, we built them as a temporary structure, as an outdoor pavilion, as an agglomeration of projects, of rooms that were designed that belongs to other projects. And then they come together, they come together like a medieval city, buildings that were built over time. It has relationships to the industrial complex next to it. It was built very temporarily. It was all cladded in white in the interior for outdoor exhibitions. And then the metal studs were completely exposed like a stage set. So it existed only for 3 months during the duration of this Triennale. But for us, it became a manifesto project. And also, as creators or architects, it also creates certain surprises of spaces that but know in a very different context. And suddenly, this room so well. And then you see right next to it is a project by Kirsten and David, or right cutting through it is a project by Nuno. So new type of relationships begin to occur for us as this melange of rooms coming together in an unexpected way. So this was like a beach project right next to Kirsten's courtyard, right next to a corridor designed by Nuno, but all done in a very provisional way. So here you see it in context. For me, when I see this aerial photograph, our little installation is takes on a very counter position of what Amanda Levet of Future Systems did for the Matt Museum that was built with this very smooth and sculptural form, right along the river. Is it a singular vision, or is the future of architecture really a series of things that come together out of multiple visions? I think many of these exhibition projects, like this was a proposal for a pavilion, begin to inform our more permanent scale architectural projects. So this whole idea of a temporary pavilion as a cigarette, begins to inform a project and competition that we did on the University of Illinois Chicago campus, which had a lot of buildings done by Walter Netsch of SOM in the 60s, very brutalist, slightly organic. And then how we built two performance centers, or how we designed two performance centers that is really the same form, a cigarette form, one right side up, the other upside down, but having a much more or less brutal facade or countenance that has more transparency that one could see through, or more light that could emit through the building. So on one hand, being contextual to the brutalism of the history of the campus, on the other hand, creating something much more lighter and much more transparent and friendly through these perforated facades. So this project, although the perforation or the scaling of it has to do with creating a texture, creating light and versus shadow, it begins to also inform construction for other projects. So, for example, this is a project where we have a studio for UCLA graduate studios, where we have to renovate an existing 1940s warehouse for art studios, but also build a new building around it. So the context was very much this kind of Eric Owen Moss, very expressive, expressionist type of modern architecture, in contrast to these lightweight industrial warehouses that was from the turn of the century. So for us, our building really belongs to the type of the warehouses, but we looked into how the construction of those warehouses, which a lot of them were tilt-up concrete construction, begin to inform the design of the work. So the necessary incorporation for seismic with the columns, and how creating a new texture that begins to emulate the columns, create this new texture that we learned actually from the Chicago competition. So all these were poured on the floor and then hoisted up in place. And in contrast to the more solid exterior, we have these spaces or these courtyards that are covered but not insulated. So they're half-covered spaces for the workshops, for the metal shop, for the ceramic shop, that are semi-outdoor spaces for the art studios. So this idea of crenellation also begins to inform other projects or other competition projects, or this contrast between the textured exterior versus a more open interior spaces for studios, for other projects. For this coming one is a competition that we did for Rice University that took the UCLA project and began to think about the texture of brickwork and also 1930s interwar German expressionists, brick architecture in the Weimar Republic, and how that type of warehouse architecture began to inform the design of a new art school or a place for production. Although this is a new building, I think this terracing and its connection to the adjacent art center, the exhibition space, but as a place for production, so a lot of the messiness of the creation of sculpture or painting is in contrast to a more maybe solemn exterior that also deals with the history of the campus that was designed by Ralph Adams Cram in the early 20th century, and how this campus could evolve, whether creating a strong coherence on the exterior in contrast to maybe a much more lighter, much more casual interior spaces for these art studios. And then the idea of museums and educational spaces extended to this project, but this is the Philadelphia Contemporary Project. It's right next to University of Pennsylvania and Drexel University. It's also within a very low-income, predominantly African-American neighborhood that's deteriorating. So programmatically, when we thought about the project, we thought about the period while before the museum was built, and they need to fundraise for it. How does the museum has a presence within the city? So we came up with this idea with the Philadelphia Contemporary of these small houses that could be built and could inhabit different parts of the city during the years when the fundraising for this museum happens. And then when the building was finished, all these houses could come back to the mothership. So this is a model that shows the basic building with a series of what we call tables, and the tables support these houses that were situated at different parts of the city. Sometimes there's a greenhouse, sometimes it turns into a water tower, sometimes it's a DJ booth. But we also see these as places that could host businesses or pop-up shops for the local community. So I think these little buildings that surrounds or sit around on and around these little tables becomes the connection to the neighborhood and the community. We were looking a lot into a half timber construction that was turned into steel construction, and the amount of educational spaces that always inhabit the threshold between the interior and the exterior. So I think this idea of time, and collaboration, whether actively collaborating with someone that creates the building with you, or working with history, working on museum projects, oftentimes we are dealt with buildings that was built in a very different time and a different concern, and how we extend to these buildings and how we respond to what was done at that time and while projecting a future has been something that we had been exposed to. So this is a project for the Museum of Contemporary Art, designed by Arata Isozaki, who I understand has a great exhibition here, finished in 1986. It was a building that was, when it was built, there was nothing around, so it was really like a boat on a dry dock. And over time, all these buildings were built around it. There are additions that were made, there are new canopies. So what used to be, this was Isozaki's drawing, what used to be a very Giorgio di Chirico-esque, almost like a temple sitting on top of the hill, eventually was infested with all these differences, all these new buildings of different scales that were not planned at that moment. So as we were charged to think about the future of this museum in two different stages, we thought about how to respond to a future that this building didn't know, at the outset, and how certain things that were added could be taken away, could really reinstate the quality, the center of the museum, and at the same time, adding on new buildings, new galleries to it. It's very difficult to add on to a building with such a very, maybe not personal, but a very direct language of Isozaki used working on this Euclidean geometries of barrel vaults, of pyramids, and we tried many things that for us didn't work until we found a project that Isozaki did around the same time for a house, where he cuts the corner of a house to almost create a gable roof type of silhouette while letting natural light into the corners. Well, that's when we found the Rosetta Stone. We thought then we begin to multiply that and to create almost a string of windows. Strangely, when we tested in the models, it worked well with Isozaki form, maybe because it's not directly an imitation of the language of the forms he had used, but it has relational aspects to it. So using a language that we didn't invent, but already by the original architect, but deploying it differently, strangely, it worked well for this project. So this is something that, like, this was the original house that Isozaki designed, same time when he was doing the museum. Yeah. So that became multiplied, and we even propose this using the same red sandstone. Our goal is that if one has never been to Los Angeles, you go there for the first time, you don't know which is the new building, which is the old. I think this is always a quality of city that is really not necessarily the signature of the architect, but how layers of architecture forms this palimpsest of a city of culture and history. So this project is also related to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. It was designed by Joseph Paul Kleihues. This was designed 10 years after Isozaki. So similar to the Isozaki project, it was a very Eurocentric or European focused project. I think the heuristic model was based on the Altes Museum, or the type of neoclassical Germanic architecture, and also this notion of rational grid that went through the whole building. So our first phase of this project was really utilizing that grid that Kleihues used, Ungers used, and how we puncture the building with new connections, as well as creating new ways. Like, this is a new floor that was added for an artist installation of Pedro and Joana from Mexico, or opening up the stairs, but using the language that Kleihues has used as a reference, but not directly copying, but using that geometry to create something new, but responds to the older building. So this is completely a lower storage floor that turned into a public space, working together, with an artist on all the murals and the coloration as a setup for the future addition of this building, which we plan to extend out, using the same grid as Kleihues did, and creating an atrium and a courtyard. But at the same time, turning the sandstone that they use in the existing building, which we open up in the base, to something that is more of an aluminum cladding that is also oil canned a little bit, so it reflects the light very differently. We saw the SOM Inland Steel building, it's 70 years old. So the tautness of the skin that was built when it was in the 50s were all like crumbled a little bit, oil canning, we call. And it really, when you see it in sunset, it really creates this really shimmering light. It's very Gary-esque, So we love that aspect of this contrast between this strong rationality and this lightness of the building, So we are proposing that for the side that faces the river. Now, this is a competition that we did that we lost, but this was a project for the Dallas Art Museum that was designed by Edward Larrabee Barnes in 1983. And this was a project when we entered the competition, we actually invited a lot of architects to work with us. We invited Moss from the US, Chris Gantenbein from Switzerland, Sam Jacob from London. It's a big museum, it's a big addition. So we thought of how we can design together, and almost like a little city, everyone takes on a very different part, adding onto a spine, articulating the spine, adding on objects within the space, whether it's light wells to let light in, or stairwells that take on a different form. It repeats the form that was done before that was more opaque and more closed into something much lighter and much more transparent. And here are some of the interiors. Although this was a project that we did not win, I really love this process of working together with others. So we always think about, use the analogy of the city as a chess match, like a chess game. You know, one architect makes a move, the other makes another move. And then afterwards, you know, we, at the end, it's not about which is a better move, but at the end, how do we create a beautiful game, you know? And I think this is one of these projects that the process of which really exemplifies what I'm looking for, you know, or what I'm looking for in the next 25 years, I hope. So let's see, I have 4 more minutes. And I have actually more slides, but because this was going slower than I thought. So I'm just going to go through this very quickly. I think as we continue on working on projects, we sometimes work with architects who are alive when we sometimes work with architects who are not, you know. So this is a project that we and Kristen Gantenbein are working on for the renovation of the Kunstmuseum in Basel. You know, they added on the new building that you see a little bit on the left-hand side, but the original structure, you know, which is incredible. If you have not been, you know, you might not be able to tell the differences we're trying to create in this renovation. It's really opening up what the building was supposed to be, but like a certain symmetry that never become, one side was closed, one side was open, how the roof deck was never really opened upon, and how over time when things were added, some connections to the outside was cut off, and how that could be reestablished. Rethinking about how the whole entry sequence, how tickets are purchased, courtyards in the back that was privatized, how we can make them public again. Also, these transition spaces between galleries and the interior and exterior, how they could be activated while really have absolutely no invention visually visible into the old galleries, really preserving the galleries with new technology of light and air for the artwork, while having very, very subtle surgeries that were done on the exterior. I think in many ways, this is the final project that I'm showing that's not attached to Renzo Piano's first US building in North America, the Menil Center, but then it's part of that larger campus. And so it's also for us a part of that response. You know, when this building was built, it was built in a neighborhood where all these buildings around were West Texas houses. They were very small. That was the only large building there. And over time, more of these other institutional buildings were built. Some were built by Renzo, some by others, but they're always related to the single family house scale. So I think what we're trying to do here with the new Drawing Institute is to create an intermediary scale. So as opposed to there were small buildings, and then there were medium-sized buildings, and then there were big buildings. The big building was already there. The small buildings were already there. How do we build an intermediary scale building to bridge that? You know, it's almost like the missing piece, you know. So scale wise, it's a very horizontally spread building, but height wise, you know, it's important for us to be defer itself to the larger buildings while connecting to the smaller building. At the same time, have a very confident countenance of facing the future developments. So the scale of this building really came from the courtyards, the scales that does not exist, you know, and also creating a series of shading devices that blur the transition between the exterior and the interior. So I think the steel certainly has a lot to do with Renzo, but the interior really comes from these gable roofs, these dormer windows, the scale that were familiar within the neighborhood all these years, whether they be exhibition spaces or interior spaces. Each courtyard outdoor rooms that contain a very different landscape. Some of them are connected only to the sky, and some of them are connected to the neighborhood with a much more domestic landscape. I think this is one of the projects that for us summarizes many of the things that we have been trying to do, you know, whether it's thinking about the history that related to an evolving campus, whether it's an art campus or a residential neighborhood, but the whole notion of collaborating, like in this case, less with other architects, but more with the artists, with the curators, or with the performances after the building was finished that was done for the exhibitions, and also with one of Ellsworth Kelly's last project, the Menil Curve, that was done as a dedication piece. And I always like to finish a talk before the allotted time, and I have 13 seconds. Thank you very much.